I think we're live. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Adam Smith Institute webinar. My name's Joe Bradshaw, and I'm a research associate here at the Adam Smith Institute. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Adam Smith Institute is a think tank that aims to change public opinion through research, media, and events like these. Tonight's webinar will be about private military companies. Private military companies can be found across the globe and have been for millennia, although not necessarily by the name PMC. Mercenaries were used by the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Carthaginians, and countless nations and empires after. It's actually a fairly new idea that a soldier must be loyal to their nation state and nobody else. In this webinar, we'll be looking at PMCs from a number of different perspectives, including how the introduction of a profit incentive changes military operations, the regulation of PMCs, and the direction of the market. And on our panel of experts this evening, we have Alexander Stronel of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Cyberspace and Future Conflict Programme, Andrew Farquhar of Gardaworld, and Dr. Andreas Krieg, a political risk analyst and lecturer at King's College's School of Security Studies. So I'm now going to hand you over to Alex Stronel, who will be discussing the difference between Russian and Western PMCs, their role, and how the introduction of a profit incentive changes warfare. Over to you, Alex.
Good evening. Can you see my PowerPoint okay? Yes? Joe, can you see me? Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak. My name is Alexander Stronel. I'm a research assistant, as Joe said, with the Cyberspace and Future Conflict Programme at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And the focus of our programme, unsurprisingly, given the name, is future warfare. And of course, private military companies are acquiring an ever-increasing role on the modern battlefield. And my programme has been kind enough to let me, as it were, kind of not exactly do my own thing, but go off and look a little bit at Russian private military companies. So this really is my focus. Excuse me. I have published on the issue anonymously, and I should also add the caveat that Western PMCs are not exactly my focus. Nevertheless, Joe has asked me to look at a number of questions, if I just bring up the next slide, including the difference between Russian and Western PMCs. And as requested, I'm going to start with a quick definition of PMC, then I'm going to head on to the key differences between Russian and Western practice, which I hope will be the real core of my presentation. And at the end, having given you some of the information I want to give you, I'm going to try and tackle some of the other questions that Joe's given me if I have the time. At this point, I kind of want to stress two very quick things. So firstly, in my presentation, I want to look at state practice, i.e. how states use PMCs. I haven't got a huge amount of time, so I don't want to dwell exactly on the private sector because I know other panelists are going to want to speak about that. And I don't want to deviate too much from this specifically Russian and Western comparison practice. I also want to ask you, if you don't mind, to treat some of the statistics I'm going to show you with a pinch of salt, particularly the casualty statistics from Syria. I'll give you a bit more detail about that when we get a bit further on. But I just wanted to say that at the outset. So to start off with the real sort of simple housekeeping, what is a private military company? And it's a shame, really, that I wasn't invited like maybe a week later, because we actually have a senior fellow who's working on a detailed methodology for the analysis of non-state actors. And we are developing a definition and an official IISS definition for a PMC, but nevertheless, it hasn't been published yet. So I went, after some head scratching, I decided to go with the definition provided by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is, and they define a private military and security company as a private business concern, private business concerns that provide military and or security services, irrespective of how they describe themselves. And then it goes on to provide 4 roles that a PMC may fulfill. I believe this definition is taken from the Montreux document, which is a sort of non-binding international agreement, which I'll get onto in a minute. So that you can see the 4 roles given there: the provision of armed guards, maintenance and operation of weapon systems, prisoner detention, advice to and training of local forces and security personnel. I'd like to make 4 chief remarks about this definition before I move on to the core of my presentation. First, it does not distinguish between private security and military companies. Much of the academic literature, and certainly the enterprises themselves, either for the purpose of image or role, they certainly do distinguish. But no, here, it lumps them all together in one basket from the perspective, of course, of international humanitarian law. Second, it provides no mention of a profit motive. And while in some respects this is quite unsurprising because it's approaching the question from a legal perspective, this does put it at variance with a lot of the academic literature. And third, in the example roles provided, there is no mention of direct and active role in combat operations. And there's a very good reason for this, and that is that the legal status of a PMC contractor deployed for the explicit purpose of taking part in combat is highly uncertain in international humanitarian law. More on all this in a moment. I want to flesh it out as the presentation continues. So moving on to the heart of the presentation, I've identified what I think are the 3 key differences between Russian and Western practice when it comes to private military companies. Excuse me. The first is profit motive. I'll get on to this in a second. The second is information, and I divide this into 2 categories. So there's the use of PMCs to gain strategic advantage on the one hand, i.e. by strategic deception. And on the other hand, it's reputational, which is the use of PMCs to alleviate negative reputational effects of entanglement, either domestically or internationally. I think personally more domestically, but I'll get into that in a second. And finally, role, i.e. how PMCs are used by states in combat zones. So each of these is progressively more different. So from the profit motive up to the role, profit motive, which has certain similarities, it bears certain similarities to Western practice, up to role, which is to say how PMCs are used in combat zones and elsewhere. So, profit motive. I don't want to dwell on this too much because I think some of the other panelists are going to want to talk about this. But what I want to say is we need to avoid the caricature or assumption that because Russian PMCs very often have very close links to the state, and Wagner, I'm assuming a lot of us are familiar with Wagner, the PMC connected with Prigozhin. I'll get on to him in a second, that because they have very close links to the Russian state, that they have no profit motive whatsoever. It's a lazy distortion to say that over here we have Western PMCs, which are driven by a profit motive, and over here we have Russian PMCs which are simply proxies of the state. There are a number of reasons for this. So firstly, there are in fact legitimate private military companies, Russian private military companies, by which I mean companies that appear to be independent of the state and of oligarchs close to the Kremlin, and which exist purely for the purposes of making money. And it makes sense as well, because Russia has a large military, it has a well-trained military. The employment opportunities outside Moscow and St. Petersburg aren't very good. It makes a lot of sense that since the 1990s, private military companies have popped up in Russia. Secondly, it is at least claimed, although personally I take this with a pinch of salt, that in some cases, in the West, there have been times when there was no profit motive for a Western PMC. So an example of this is Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, who claimed in his book about Blackwater, about Operation Enduring Freedom, that they weren't getting involved because of any sort of business rationale, but because of patriotic motives. Now, personally, I take that with a pinch of salt, but it has to be said sort of for balance here. And finally, and most importantly, we know that Russian PMCs, and even those closely connected to the state, have likely made financial gain at the same time as participating in operations that are closely aligned with Moscow's strategic objectives. So there are, for example, credible reports that companies linked to Prigozhin, the oligarch known as Putin's chef, in case you don't know who that is, has signed deals with the Syrian government to receive a large portion of profits from oil fields recovered by his PMCs from ISIS. We also know that the same guy has signed, for example, deals with the Central African Republic for the exploration of precious minerals. On an individual level, that is to say the individual fighters, the individual contractors, the motives for joining are not completely different. We know that the comparatively generous salaries, or exceptionally generous if the reports about the more recent Russian PMCs are to be believed, that the comparatively generous salaries are an important reason for Russians to, as it were, join the private military companies. It also has to be added here, sort of in reference to Prigozhin, as sort of side note, that even as regards to the West, the dubious relationship between natural resources and PMCs is not absent. In fact, it's quite long-standing. So the main difference lies in the fact that in the case of Russia, the profit motive is not always obvious. So that does not mean, of course, that it's not always there, that it's not there, but I think we can assume that there are times, as we were about to see in the next part of the presentation, that it is very probable that the profit motive does not exist and that the PM series is simply, that is, operating as a proxy of the state purely because of the attributes that a PMC can offer that suit the objectives of the state. Secondly, the second point is information. First, strategic deception. Moscow is willing to use PMCs as a means of strategic deception. This, in and of itself, sets it apart from Western practice. To my knowledge, Western PMCs have not been used in this manner, although perhaps some of the other panelists can offer some comment on this. The most obvious example of this remains the annexation of Crimea in 2014, where so-called little green men, among whom we do know to have been contractors of private military companies, delayed the reaction in Western capitals due to the uncertainty surrounding their origin. But this is by no means the only example. The emergence of Russian PMCs on several continents leaves think tankers like myself, and I imagine people in government scratching their heads. In theory, these could be there because of profit motive, they could be there because of Moscow's strategic objectives. The truth is that the point, or one of the benefits that PMCs deliver to Moscow, is that they provide this deception, this cover. The benefit for Moscow lies in the fact that they create a detachment between the state and the body on the ground for the specific purpose of confusing and delaying the response of adversary states. And that is a key difference between Russia and the West. Secondly, reputational. Both the United States and Russia resort to the use of PMCs in order to keep the number of regular troops on the ground at a minimum. And I assert to counteract the negative effects that casualties among regular forces have on domestic and possibly international reputation. The similarities are actually relatively palpable. In the United States and in the West in general, after many years in the Middle East, we all know there was this general fatigue. Public opinion developed this significant aversion to casualties. It's not that different in Russia. I wrote my master's thesis on public opinion in Russia, on how public opinion affects foreign policy in Russia. And at the beginning of the operation in Syria, Putin he went on TV and he categorically promised the Russian people that there would be no ground operation in Syria. And even though that hasn't been completely true, the state media narratives have generally sustained an image of the conflict, of Russia's involvement in the conflict, as an air campaign. And polling has continuously shown stubborn resistance in Russia to any kind of ground invasion. There are, however, important differences between the West and Russia in how this has panned out. And before I move on to the next slide, the caveats they offered at the beginning. First, none of these statistics are in any sense complete. The statistics I'm about to cite from a study by these two guys in America called Schooner and Swan are taken from the US Department of Labor, and they are based on insurance claims. So they're not complete, but they do paint a picture. And secondly, the statistics that I have gathered on Russia are not complete either, and I'll explain those a bit more. And thirdly, of course, very important point, we need to bear in mind that the character of the conflicts that we're about to compare, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, are different. And that needs to be borne in mind when we're considering these statistics. So firstly, here we are looking at PMC versus US troop deaths in Iraq, 2003 to 2011. So there are years, as we can see, 2009, 2010, where contractor casualties exceed casualties in the regular armed forces, even though the overall fatalities decrease as time goes on. The proportion sustained by contractors increases. I'll just leave you a quick second to take in that information, because Afghanistan tells a sort of confirmatory, that's a word, story here. Since as overall fatalities go up, the proportion sustained by contractors also goes up. Right. Now, my statistics on Syria. As you can see, these are telling us a very, very different story. So in my view, it's quite obvious that in both cases, both the United States government and Russia is using the PMCs in order to deal with the negative reputational effects of their foreign interventions. But they are qualitatively different. They are very, very different indeed. So in America, when it comes to America, we see sort of like this gradual convergence, if you like, sort of rise in the use of contractors as time goes on. In the case of Russia, we see immediately from the beginning that it's an order of magnitude different. Now, again, I'll explain a bit more about where I got these statistics. So the Russian troops, these are official statistics as reported from the Ministry of Defense in Kommersant, which is a relatively reliable Russian newspaper. Those are the official statistics of Russian troops that have died in Syria. They may be massaged. There's no telling when it comes to Russia, but that is what the official statistics say. The contractor deaths are calculated from various different sources: media reports, estimates from people who are on the ground who have been interviewed by journalists, particularly Russian journalists. And if you are interested in this, I really suggest you read the Russian material on this. It's very, very interesting. Most of it's been translated into English. Now, the point that I really want to get across here is that while both sides are using PMCs for reputational reasons, at the core of it, Russia is far more willing, it does appear, to use PMCs in such a way to essentially cover up casualties. Whereas in America, it's it's been a gradual thing. The second point I want to make very, very quickly, because I know that time is running out, is that Russia also has tools to maintain this reputational advantage, which are not available to other states. Here is a very, very good example. I don't want to dwell on this too quickly because I know time is ticking. This is a quote from the chairwoman of the Union of Committees of Soldiers' Mothers. These are very important pressure groups in Russia. This was a quote. It was obtained by Deutsche Welle. It appeared in one of their publications. I translated it from the Russian. And essentially, what you can see is that they won't touch this issue with a barge pole. So for Russia, there are tools available to how would you say this, to blunt the effect of public opinion that are not necessarily available to Western states, and they're far more willing to use them. That is to say that these pressure groups, which in the past, in the Afghanistan war, for example, have caused serious headaches for Russian governments when it comes to the right treatment of troops, to drawing attention to casualties, drawing attention to conditions, an example, they will not touch the issue of PMCs. They know that this is off limits for them. They won't go near it. Finally, role, because this is really the most important thing that I want to get across, because this is where the practice of Russia and the West diverges most dramatically. Russia is willing to deploy PMCs with the specific intention of using them to perform functions that Western states would recognize as inherently governmental. That is an American phrase that appears in American law, that appears in DoD documents all the time, and that includes high-intensity operations. Now, I'm not saying that Western states have never ever used in the past used mercenaries in high-intensity combat operations. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that right now, Russia is far more willing to deploy PMCs with the specific intention of carrying out high-intensity combat operations. And we can tell this because domestic media reports suggest that Russian PMC contractors experience very high casualties. By some accounts, only 1/3 of PMC contractors deployed to Syria actually return uninjured. What we know about the organizational structure of Russian PMCs suggests an intention to use them in high intensity combat. And just very, very quickly, there's this great quote, which comes from a investigation by Fontanka, which is an independent newspaper based in St. Petersburg. And this is an interview with a Wagner fighter who was fighting in Syria. He was deployed in Syria. And the journalist asked him, so how many people were in your unit? 250? And he goes, are you kidding? Think about it. And he goes on to explain in very significant detail the structure of his unit. So 3 reconnaissance assault companies, each with 90 to 100 men, 3 platoons with recoilless rifles and automatic grenade launchers. That's the fire support company, an air defense company, a communications company, a guard company, a medical unit, plus civilian service personnel. Minus civilians, we're talking about 600. So what you can tell here is that they are using them very, very differently. And I'm going to end there because I know that time has run out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was very interesting. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, who is Andrew Farquhar of Gardaworld, who's going to be discussing how PMCs can improve their services, how they can be better regulated, and the role localism can play. Now, over to you, Andrew.
Joe, good evening, and thank you very much, Steve, for the opportunity to join. And I'll crack on because time is tight. But I'm going to divert from what you've just billed me to say that Alexander's talked about what I would call, and this is a personal view, the Wagner Group, which is an arm of the state. And Alexander said that so in furious agreement, because they are de facto a more subtle, if you like, use of Russian military power. And that is not what a private security company from the West, or most private security companies across the world, do. So I think Alexander's piece there set the scene for mine, which is going to be almost the reverse, insofar as it's going to talk about legislation, it's going to talk about standards, it's going to talk about localization, working with local governments, supporting humanitarian efforts, and broadly speaking, providing the security whilst guarding human rights of the communities within which we operate. So with that as an unintended introduction, I'm just going to talk about, firstly, the legal basis. There is a claim that PSCs exist in a legal vacuum and operate beyond accountability. Well, that almost could not be further from the truth, because the College of Europe in 2006 called together a whole variety of people on international law as private security companies were being used more and more in complex environment. And they decided, this College of Europe meeting, that there was no gap in the law, but it was just exceptionally complex. And these environments are extremely complex. And they said what was required was a review of existing law. And so the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Swiss government set about convening a meeting at Montreux of 7 initially states and ultimately ended up as 17 states, who produced a document which has become a very famous document called the Montreux document. And it laid out legal obligations and good practice, if you like, for private security companies. There are now 57 states signed up to that Montreux document. Interestingly enough, the 57th was Malta last year. And also the European Union as an entity has signed the Montreux document, as has OSCE and as has NATO. So that was the basis upon which the international community came together and remains together to try and support guidance and regulations for private security companies. And from the Montreux document, which was written in 2008, a thing called the International Code of Conduct was written in 2010 in Montreux, and it's the guardians, if you like, of the Swiss. And subsequently, the International Code of Conduct has now got an association, which had its first annual General Assembly in 2013. And since then, it's been operationalizing the code. So there is a framework, a legal structure, an international understanding of how PSCs should behave and be governed. And one of the points I'd like to make is that private security companies, unlike military security companies like the Wagner Group and the Russian piece, operate as a commercial entity, as Alexander said. And in order to do that, they have to be licensed and operate within the law. And so PSCs, such as mine, operate to the law of the country in which we operate. We operate to international law, and we also operate to the law of our licensing home country. So, for example, the entity I operate in Garda World is in the UK. So I'm bound by UK law, the law of the host country, as I mentioned, which could be, let's say, Afghanistan, or it could be a country in Africa, and international law. And even beyond those, if we were to do some of the stuff that the Wagner Group is doing in Libya, in Syria, and elsewhere, arguably, one could be seen to be conducting war crimes because you're not a formal state actor, and certainly crimes against humanity. And there's a piece of American legislation called the Alien Tort Statute, which, broadly speaking, has been in action for many, many years. and it gives US federal courts the jurisdiction to hear lawsuits filed against non-US citizens who commit violations of international law. So there's another legislative path by which PSCs can be held to account. And moving now into what I would argue is more important, which is standards and how private security companies globally are being encouraged to raise their standards and become very focused on security of their clients and their assets whilst working within the community they operate. And these are international standards. And I'm going to run off some numbers which aren't particularly interesting, but it's important background. International Standard 18788 was drafted in 2015 and is a standard specifically to look at guiding private security operations and private security companies. And it's not only is it guidance, it's a requirement. So if you conform to this standard, you are required to do a variety of human rights assessments, make sure you conduct an assessment involving the local community and the local authorities. So that standard was in effect one of the first moving forward, engaging fully with human rights. A second standard, which came out just before 18788, which was Private Security Company Standard 1. It's an American standard, very similar in construct, if you like, to 18788, but is an American national standard. So there are both international and national standards applicable to the behavior of private security companies. There's also a maritime standard called 28007. And from those three standards was built the certification for the compliance to the International Code of Conduct, which, as I mentioned, reaches back into the Montreux document. And to gain certification and become a member of the International Code of Conduct Association, private security companies have to conform with one of those three international standards, or national standard in the case of the American PSC 1. But also, they have to fill in a further questionnaire from the Code of Conduct Association Secretariat, which fills in some of the gaps that they feel there is in the human rights aspects of the international standards. So there's a whole raft of structures, standards, laws, legislation, which governs private security companies. And the growth of the membership of the International Code of Conduct Association was pretty electric in the first few years. Now you've got to work rather harder to remain a member. It's dropped down a bit, but there are some 98 global private security companies who are full members or members aspiring to be full members of the Code of Conduct Association. And there are 42 civil society organizations, 54 observer organizations, and interestingly, there are 7 governments who have signed up to be government members of the Code of Conduct Association. So it's a pretty powerful, if you like, incentive for private security companies to become accredited and to behave in the right manner. And not only do you just get certified to this, but the Code of Conduct Association will then come out and monitor and assess your performance. They have an oversight role of visiting private security companies and making sure that they are behaving in conformance to the International Code of Conduct. They also have a complaints mechanism. So if individuals feel they can't complain against PSCs, they can do so through the Code of Conduct Association. And lastly, there's the very certification process itself, where the evidence has to be supplied and then refreshed every year, with full certification being every 3 years. So I think I would just like to sort of end that paragraph on the fact that PSCs, certainly Western PSCs, are very highly advised, governed, and are subject to a whole variety of laws. And the other thing is, and as Alexandra mentioned earlier on, we're commercial organizations. I would not be sitting here if we weren't paid and we made profit. And profit isn't a dirty thing in industry. Industry has got to make profit. So we do that. Now, the people who generate our profit for us are our clients. And if you look at the clients we operate for, some of them are NGOs in their own right. Some of them are humanitarian actors. Some of them are infrastructure providers to get better water, to get better power into these countries that are post-conflict and need support. And some of them are diplomatic clients. And then there's the oil and gas companies who are becoming as green as they can be, as fast as they can be. And all of them do not want a private security company which is misbehaving and not doing what it should do. So the very fact that we're a profit organization brings us into better behaviors and makes us perform better as we do our business. And I think that's a pretty fundamental point. And I'd just like to finish this little bit about a US perspective, because again, Alexandra mentioned the US using private security companies in a novel way. Nowhere near, I would argue, like the Wagner Group and Russia. But there are some US security companies who perhaps are on the line, but those that work for the Department of Defense, the Department for State, and the US government broadly conform with what I'm explaining as what I see as a Western PSC. And the Department of Defense in 2019 suggested that private security companies provide inherently non-governmental protection of personnel, property, and activities in contingencies and complex environments. So inherently non-governmental protection, which to me means they are not military by definition, because military actors are state actors. And I would just go down a bit of a rabbit hole here and say to Alexander, when IISS look at the name of private security companies, veer away, I would suggest, from the Montreux document and look at what the reality is. In the US, they define military security companies as those companies that provide logistic support for military operations. So they're technicians who fix engines, who keep aircraft flying, who maintain pipelines for the military supply chain. It is not the fact they conduct military offensive operations, because private security companies do not conduct offensive operations at all. They conduct defensive operations and remove themselves from any point of risk as quickly as possible, because that's what their clients pay them to do. They do not get paid by their clients to conduct offensive military operations. Okay, so the second thing I'd just like to say that is very useful from the American experience is that the use of PSCs is limited solely to self-defense and defense of others against unlawful attack, again, not military operations. And the fact that their methods and techniques must promote and not undermine the longer-term stability of the area and region in which they operate. And the fact that any misconduct by a private security company, particularly one they would argue employed by the US government, any misbehavior has an impact on the standards of and reputation of all the other private security companies in that area. So the US government is absolutely clear that they're not military security companies, they're private security companies conducting legal defensive operations to nurture their clients. Okay, so my next sort of theme is that in order to ensure that what I say is a reality on the ground, states who license, states who contract with oil and gas companies, infrastructure companies, who then subcontract their security function to private security companies globally, need to make sure that their private security companies are doing as they should and performing to the correct standard. And so those states that grant all these licenses and contracts need to flow down the contractual line to make sure that the private security companies operating on their behalf, in effect, are performing to standards. And this is supported by the visits and the inspections by the Code of Conduct Association, but also should be supported predominantly by those governments who should mandate that these standards are held by private security companies operating in their countries. Okay, so I think I would just simply say that there is the not often discussed side of private security companies is they are a force for good. PSCs enable international contractors who come from a more benign environment and a more mature society, if you like, in the West, and go into some of these very conflicted states which need all the support they can get to restructure themselves after a conflict situation. So that could be that they need a review of their governance regime, they need their judiciary, perhaps their police force needs support to grow into a more fit for purpose organization. It might be that they need to restructure all of their water, gas, everything, and PSCs enable modern Western contractors, I say Western, but modern contractors who use the latest techniques and do it effectively and speedily to improve the conditions for that emerging state to come out of conflict rather quicker. So in that respect, private security companies are a force for good. And of course, we do enable NGOs and humanitarian actors to get access to some more complex environments and deliver the aid so badly needed. And again, it's important those humanitarian roles are recognized. And just recently, we have been involved in evacuating people subject to the conflict in Palma in Mozambique. And several hundred members of the community around the Palma area were supported by private security companies to move into a more safe and secure environment. So I think as I've just had a little nudge, I will now finish there because I'm conscious we're going to have a session on Q&A, but just to make the point that PSCs are forces for good. They are they're well covered by legislation, and they are driven by their clients who hire them to have high standards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker, Dr. Andreas Krieg, who is going to be discussing the direction of the private military market and the concept of warfare by delegation. Over to you, Andreas.
Great, thank you very much. Do I have 10 minutes or?
Yes.
Okay, and we have to finish sharp at 7, so I'll try to be as brief as I possibly can. Just to say, I'm not going to touch upon the Russians, and I will also not touch on the private security industry in the UK. I wrote my PhD on this many years ago, and I can very much echo what Andrew had to say in regard to the industry in this country and private security companies. I want to talk a bit more about private military as on the higher end and more towards the tip of the spear in terms of the services that are being provided. As well as I want to look particularly at the UAE as one of these game-changing countries that I think need to be named in the same in the same instance as you talk about Russia, because they've been somewhat intervening in the industry and have kind of brought the industry onto a new trajectory. I've just recently published a book called Surrogate Warfare, and it's about the externalization of the burden of warfare to a range of different surrogates, some of them technological, but for the most part human surrogates. Could be militia groups and obviously could be private military and security companies as well. And the market for force, it can very much be and is a very essential part of that delegation. And as Andrew rightly said, the vast majority of services that are being provided here are security services that are being provided in a defensive manner. The vast majority are actually unarmed services that are being provided. And that bit, what is always most controversial that people talk about, this provision of armed services, is very much a very, very small chunk of the vast support services that the industry provides to government today. And I also want to make it quite clear that the reliance that states have developed since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on that industry, have come to a level where it's, we could call it over-reliance in a way that, we cannot conduct military operations without the industry today. So why do we delegate? Delegation comes for a variety of different reasons. could be to do with capacity, could be to do with capability. Alex has already mentioned some of the motivating factors for the Russians to do it. And, you know, surrogate warfare very much fits into that. The reasons can be discretion, deniability, augmenting capability as well as capacity, and kind of acting in an environment with a degree of impunity. When we talk about the global industry for security, I think we have kind of two parallel universes there that exist. So when I started researching this industry more than a decade ago, we were still at the very height at you know, the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan that had kind of brought about a boom in the global private military and security industry. And that industry today is obviously very much, as Andrew rightly outlined, very much regulated, even albeit self-regulated, has very much existed in a realm that is no longer to be compared with the sort of mercenarism that we see with Wagner Group in North Africa, or also that we see the UAE engaging in Somalia and Yemen, and also to an extent in Libya. They're two industries. So the private security industry, for the most part, you know, providing non-governmental security functions, as Andrew rightly said. These are support functions, mostly unarmed, highly regulated, kind of in compliance with the Montreux document. There's also a race to the top rather than the bottom, because everyone who wants to contract with Western governments obviously wants to make sure that they're compliant with the regulations, even if they're industry regulations, in order to get contracts. So very much there is an incentive and motivation there for this industry to comply, because it means more business. It's been good for business, and because you want to keep reputational risk to a minimum. If we then, you know, move to that parallel universe that has developed over the last decade or so, where I think the UAE have been a major push in that direction. The Russians have jumped on the bandwagon. The Turks have jumped on the bandwagon more recently. This kind of parallel universe is more about actually providing governmental services, or inherently governmental functions, as the Americans call it. And that is more direct engagement in hostilities, war fighting capabilities that are being externalized through companies to sometimes very loose groups of individuals. So I don't want to compare them in any way to the contractors that we see operating in a commercial environment in the UK or in the United States. If we look at the commercialization over the last, you know, let's call it last 30 or 40 years, we started off with that mercenarism of the Cold War period, where we had individuals getting in for individual profit and fighting without any accountability whatsoever. That kind of led to the early 1990s breakup of the Soviet Union and a rise of private military companies such as Executive Outcomes, who I interviewed and wrote a book about a couple of years ago. And EO is a very interesting case study because they were providing warfare capabilities in a commercial environment. But again, very much an anomaly in that industry. We had Sandline as a UK offshoot, so to speak, of that industry that obviously failed. And then we had that industry push and boom in the aftermath of Afghanistan and Iraq post 9/11, which kind of gave birth to the industry as we know it today, as highly regulated. The standardization happened in that industry because of state pressure. The state is and remains the most, at least was for that period of time in the 2000s, the most important client for this industry. And they had the pressure to kind of make sure that companies comply with certain standards. And that is the case. What we've seen then, since kind of 2010, when the Emiratis started to externalize much of their warfighting capabilities to the market, i.e. to mercenary companies, and I call them that because I don't want to compare them or conflate them with private security companies, that has kind of put us onto a new trajectory in the developing world. So in the non-Western world, we see an industry developing that is exactly providing the sort of services that Andrew was talking about, that the British and the American and other Western companies do not provide, very much dissociate themselves from. And let's look at the UAE. I mean, the UAE has been engaged as a small state across the spectrum. They've been involved in kinetic war fighting in Libya. They've been engaged in the Horn of Africa, particularly Somalia, but also Yemen. And they've done so with a relatively small military. It's a military of roughly 60,000. They're a country of 1 million indigenous inhabitants, and they're engaged across a wide spectrum of the various conflicts in the Middle East. And for them, it was very important to kind of augment indigenous capacity and capability with external help. And that's what they've been doing. So their motivation to delegate has been very much an issue of capacity. But similar to what we saw with Wagner, in Somalia, in Yemen, but also in Libya, the mercenaries that were fighting on behalf of the UAE didn't get involved only because for commercial gain. Some of them are actually involved more widely in the overall grand strategic narrative of the UAE. They're interested in hunting down Islamists, fighting Islamism. So we see some of these people who joined up who actually share the same security concerns and interpretations of the UAE. But it's about augmenting capacity, it's buying in capability, and it's also about discretion. So the UAE obviously want to keep reputational risk to a minimum, and their engagement in Somalia, for example, or in Yemen, has relied on mostly Latin American mercenaries who are trained and put in uniform in the UAE and then flown out to Yemen and fight there. And when I say fighting, I'm not saying security, talking direct engagement in hostilities. In Somalia, they came up with quite a kinetic operation, a counter piracy operation, where these mercenaries were equipped with speedboats, with helicopters, and doing the sort of thing that a Western private security company would never provide. And Eric Prinz, obviously, being one of these people that played a very pivotal role in this. And to kind of just show you the overlap between Russia and the UAE in Libya, for example, so Wagner Group was paid for by the UAE to a great degree, because there are operational and strategic synergies between Russian objectives on the ground and objectives of the UAE in Libya. So it's kind of interesting how there are new relationships forming in that industry, where the money comes from the Gulf and the capability comes from Russia. And the Turks have kind of jumped on the same bandwagon, saying, in Libya, they've seen obviously Russian mercenaries coming in, and Russian and Wagner obviously contracting local Syrians to fight for them as well. That the Turks said, let's go and let's recruit some local Syrians to fight for us on the other side. And what we see is now an evolution of that industry moving away from private security into private military. And they kind of exist in parallel universes, as I said. And another, I know I'm running out of time here, but one thing I just want to mention as well, because we only speak about kinetic operations, is that I want to talk about a little bit about the information space as well. So the UAE is one of the major powers in the information space. And again, indigenous capability isn't there. Indigenous know-how isn't there. So they have gone to the market, particularly hiring Israeli private cyber firms to kind of buy in that capability as well. It's not about discretion or deniability there. It's purely about a lack of in-house capacity. And it's interesting that a very, very rich country like the UAE are able to translate financial power into political power through the market. And the market appears to provide, and I'm again saying it's not the Western market, it's a market in the developing world, are willing to provide the services as soon as a demand arises. And these are all companies who are obviously not interested in contracting with Western governance, hence why compliance for them isn't very important. But I leave it at that, so we have at least a couple of more minutes for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now, yes, so it's now time to move on to the Q&A, and we've got a couple in the chat so far. The first question is for Andrew, which is that Andrew is right to highlight that the profit motive is a good incentive for better behavior on behalf of private security companies, but doesn't it introduce the risk of regulatory capture from some of the larger PSCs, distorting foreign policy decisions, for example?
Yeah, I'm not sure I grasp the full scope of the question there, but I mean, I think if you're talking about the compression of the industry into significant large companies versus a plethora of smaller ones for competition, then yes, there is a consolidation of the industry going ahead. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that enables the larger companies who are more arguably focused on making sure that they behave in the right way and there's greater reputational damage, or the potential for that. It means that they will improve the performance of those smaller companies, and often they will operate in their own entities. For example, in Africa, in a small country, you may very well leave that entity operating. And I'll just add very quickly that, interestingly, part of the emergence of private security companies and operating in a more sympathetic manner in some of these countries is that we've localized our workforce, if you like, and many of our employees on the ground are local nationals. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the majority of our staff in Kabul and ditto in Baghdad in Iraq are local nationals. I'm not sure that answered the question, but I hope it at least gave it a punt in the right direction. Thanks.
No problem at all. Thank you very much. So our next question is for Andreas. And it says, Andreas discussed augmenting capacity. Does he see PMCs as a potential equalizer in the balance of power between different states, i.e. giving smaller nations an outsized influence in geopolitics?
That's a very good question. I think as the the global security environment is changing, and non-kinetic means and kind of small war capabilities become more important. I think that that mercenaries or private contractors offering their capacity and capabilities to small states in particular can be a game changer, because it allows capacity capability to be brought in that could not be developed or generated domestically. And since I think Alex was talking about it, all of this kind of existing is somewhat of a gray area. To kind of make someone a mercenary under international law, you need to kind of tick all the different boxes, and there are quite a lot of boxes to be ticked. So in that regard, you're operating in an area where you can always kind of bypass being deemed or being called a mercenary. And I think that the reputational risk for many of more rogue states, non-Western states in the developing world, the reputational risk is relatively low. We've seen, though, and I've just published something on Boko Haram and the fight that Nigeria was directing against Boko Haram using a company called STTEP, which were former executive outcomes operatives. And again, we can see that a developing nation like Nigeria has been buying in capability of coin warfare into their own armed forces with quite a lot of success. So creating a sort of an assemblage between the market and the state that kind of generates an outcome that overall is fairly positive. But obviously there are certain issues with this, because as you build these assemblages, accountability is not really been taken care of. And obviously, who's making sure that for companies that operate in third world countries or in developing world countries without the regulatory framework, who makes sure that there is a degree of compliance? So compliance really comes then down to the individual contractor and the individual company, and that is a bit more problematic. And it kind of leads to a new rebalancing of power. In the case of the UAE, that's absolutely the case. It's a country that has a lot of wealth, but no human capacity and very few capabilities. But the market has allowed them to kind of close that gap in a way and push and punch way above their conventional weight.
Perfect. So we've got another one in the chat which says, is a rise of PMCs also due to societal changes whereby populations no longer tolerate casualties in wars, driving states to the market? So this is what you were talking about, Alex, where states like Russia are using PMCs to cover up their casualties. So yeah, what do you think? Do you think it's to do with the societal change where countries aren't able to accept casualties from their own country?
I'm not sure if I would call it change exactly, because I mean, it's fairly long-standing to be skeptical about casualties, right? It goes back to post-war period. But I would say that fatigue associated with, in the West especially, associated with, in the United States in particular, associated with the wars in the Middle East, is probably what led them to turn to private military companies. There are a number of benefits that especially the United States gets from it. As I understand it, they don't need permission from Congress to deploy private military companies. They don't really keep accurate statistics on the private military companies, the numbers that are deployed and the numbers, for example, who die out there. And therefore the accountability is lower. The study that I mentioned actually has a very interesting survey of sort of social media comments on private military contractors, and the general conclusion of the two who wrote the study is that the death of a private military contractor simply does not have the same level, does not, how would you say it? It simply does not have to carry the same cost in terms of reputational costs for the United States government. Yes, it's the same. It's not exactly the same in Russia for multiple reasons, but I think chief among which, of course, Russia hasn't necessarily been involved in very recently in entanglements in the Middle East, but nevertheless, the memory of Afghanistan is very much imprinted on public opinion, in public memory in Russia, which is one of the reasons why I think that they turn to their private military companies to get the job done.
Sure. Now, I see that Andreas has raised his hand, so I think he wants to add something to that.
Just very quickly, I think this is again a very. I wrote my entire PhD around the question of how we can use the market in case of casualty aversion and a casualty and politically risk averse political elite, and how the market can help with that. I do think this is not a Western, not a liberal problem. We see this in Russia very much. I think Alex even mentioned it earlier on. There was a bit of a body bag syndrome in the early days when body bags came back. There were, despite the fact that Russia is by no means a democracy, people were still asking questions about why people are dying in an out of area operation. In the UAE as well. The UAE had one single day in Yemen where they lost 55 UAE soldiers, and after that people were saying, why are we in Yemen? And again, UAE is far away from being a democracy, and so these things still, in terms of political cost minimization, the delegation to contractors or to mercenaries definitely plays in here as a way of minimizing political costs.
Yeah, very good. Sorry if I'm just pulling up some more of the questions at the moment. Now, we've got one in the chat as well. It says, can Andrew comment on the PMC operating in Mozambique in respect of defending the energy development project for Total, which came under attack by ISIS Mozambique?
I'm not going to comment in specifics about that particular issue. All I'd say is that one of the good sides of the private security companies being there, because they were defensive and not in the offensive nature, the majority of them were there in that role. Then when the insurgents came into Parma and began to clear it, there was a force which could support the extraction of the civilians who wished to leave Parma and be evacuated elsewhere into Mozambique. So the private security companies who are wholly defensive were there to support the evacuation of those individuals. There was another organization there which did support the Mozambique army, and there is a view that that was helpful in delaying the move forward of the insurgents. But I'm not going to comment further on that, other than to say that the part the PSCs, the Western PSCs did was wholly helpful by using maritime assets, evacuating people from Parma. Thanks.
Sure. Now, perfect. Thank you all so much for coming. I think this is all we've got time for since it's 7 o'clock now. I'd just like to say before we go, thank you to all the guests, and thank you to everybody for signing up to watch. And I think this is where we'll leave it. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye now.